Edward de Alvis. In 2017, Edward celebrated his 89th birthday, and it made him the oldest living resident of the Hendela Leprosy Hospital. But 2017 also marked another milestone for Edward. It was his 75th year as a patient at Hendela. Those of you who quickly did the math with me there would have figured out that Edward was just 14 years old when he was first diagnosed, just a student. Within days, he was institutionalized and separated from his family. And shocking as that sounds, it was common practice back then because we didn't have a cure for leprosy. But for Edward, it meant that from that point on, his entire life was behind those walls. From there, he lived through a world war. He saw Sri Lanka gain its independence from the British. He was there when this country's long conflict began, and there when it ended nearly 26 years later. By this point, of course, multi-drug therapy, which had debuted in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, had been used to cure Edward of his leprosy. But the stigma, that proved so much harder to shake off. Edward's parents had passed. His brothers and sisters are dead too. But they had been so ashamed of the leper in the family that they never told their children about him. And that is why Edward is still in hospital. His family doesn't know he exists, and he doesn't know how to tell them. Having heard from Edward, I became very curious about what it was like for someone today to have leprosy. And I found Kial, a young professional, who after just over a year of treatment was almost completely cured. But Kial too had faced rejection from some of those closest to him, and he was hiding his medical history from his employers. And that was how, for me, this became the story of these two men who, decades apart, contracted the same disease. By comparing the trajectories of their lives, you could see how medical advances had made for radical changes, but how, in other ways, things still stayed the same. This is what my job looks like as a journalist. I start from a point of complete ignorance, often with just the seed of a story and a lot of questions. One thing, though, after nearly 15 years of work in this field, after many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews, I have come to suspect that there is a root to this work. One quality that I count as essential. And it's definitely not that I am particularly bright. It's not that I'm a quick learner. I write about art and culture and architecture. I write about health, environment, and science. But I remember failing chemistry in school and barely scraping by in math. To date, I know nothing of art history or criticism. So it's definitely not that I'm an expert. But I think the thing that allows me to do this job, to go out every other week and write about something completely new, is simply this. I have become good at being curious. And it's why today I want to make a case for curiosity. And of course, this talk would have no value to all of you here if it was only journalists who needed to be curious. But the truth is, some of the most successful people we profile are curious themselves. And you could see how that would work, right? To stand out, to be different. You first have to be willing to ask the right questions. You have to be willing to ask what needs to change, what could be better. And at least when it comes to asking questions, I feel like everyone in this room has a small advantage. It can seem like Sri Lankans are born curious, I have been interrogated more thoroughly about my life and work by your average tuk-tuk driver in this country than I have been by any journalist I know. But jokes aside, I rely on my readers to be curious. I rely on you to care about people you might never meet, places you might never go to, issues that don't impact you directly. And it was only when I began researching this talk that I realized how odd that was. Why are you and I so curious about things that don't necessarily concern us? Well, part of the problem is that, part of the problem, of course, is that we really struggle, I think, as human beings to figure out some very key stuff. But one of the things that does work is that we are biologically incentivized to learn. A few years ago, a group of scientists at the University of California conducted an fMRI study in which they were investigating the links between curiosity and memory. And what they did is they watched their subject's brains when his or her curiosity was triggered by a trivia question, such as what is the only country in the world with a Bill of Rights for cows? The study, which was published in the journal Neuron in 2014, had many interesting findings. One of them was that feeling genuinely curious actually, triggers the reward centers in your brains. Essentially, what the scientists were saying is that when you experience genuine curiosity, your body releases dopamine, putting your brain in a state that allows you to learn and better retain even unrelated information. And so it was clear that being curious could be useful. Unfortunately, many of us still think of curiosity as something innate, as a personality trait. Perhaps something we last fully experienced when we were 2 or 3 years old and have since grown out of. But as someone who is professionally curious, I'd like to tell you that it's actually a skill you can develop. It's something you can get better at over time. And if this is an experiment that you're willing to try with me, I'd like to share 3 lessons, just 3, from my work. Step 1 of being good at curiosity is being willing to have a conversation. And now I get, as someone who speaks to many, many people, I get that small talk is boring. I get that it can be hard to sit down next to a stranger and think of something to say. But for me, the solution, both at work and off duty, has always been the same. I start with a question. Then I listen very carefully, and then I ask another question. I try very hard not to be insensitive, but I don't worry too much about being stupid or coming off as obvious. Sometimes I will even ask a question when I already know the answer, or I think I know the answer. And that's just because I've been surprised so often. I'd like to illustrate this for you with a story I worked on about the lives of 3 transgender men in Sri Lanka. I first met Ravan, and through Ravan I met Udesh, and the 3 of us had many conversations. We talked about everything you might expect. We talked about what it was like for them growing up. We talked about how hard it had been for them to come out to their parents. We talked about how humiliating a job interview can be. We even talked about what it was like to lose a friend to suicide. And then when I thought I had everything I needed, I asked Ravan a question. I asked him if he had ever seen his experiences represented in a film. And he told me about Ashoka Handagama's Flying with One Wing. It was a story about a woman who had lived as a man, marrying young, and earning a living as a garage mechanic. And then Revan told me about his friend Janaka. And he said that Janaka's life had incredible parallels to this movie. And you can imagine my astonishment, because up until this point, all my research had led me to believe that the transgender community in Sri Lanka were amongst the most misunderstood. But when I met Janaka, everything fell into place. My idle question, it turned into the heart of my story, juxtaposing fact and film to really explore what it was like to be transgender in Sri Lanka today. So what in this is useful to you? I think it's that you don't need to feel the pressure of carrying a conversation. I think it's in trusting that you can sit down next to a stranger and find value and insight. Ask a question. Listen. Go wherever that conversation and your curiosity take you. I have always found it very useful in this line of work to go looking for the stuff that surprises me, that challenges me, that is somehow unusual, because it helps me spot gaps and recognize opportunities that I might not have otherwise. I recently went to work on a piece about why Sri Lanka needed to develop a locally produced anti-venom. I remember being surprised to discover that the venom composition of Sri Lankan snakes and Indian snakes was different, even though they might belong to the same species. This difference, which was due to things like diet, impacted the effectiveness of the anti-venom. And right there was my story. I feel like I should apologize to those of you who are afraid of snakes for having shown you that picture of a saw-scaled viper. Before I began working on this story, every time I saw a snake, and I have seen a few, I would scream so high and so sharp that I hit a frequency that only dogs could hear. But something about sitting down with people who loved these animals, who wanted to protect them, who wanted to understand them, helped dilute my own terror. And it made me realize that curiosity is actually, when deployed in the right context, is actually a remarkably effective response to fear. It can help you find the courage you need to confront the unknown. I'll make another suggestion, and it's this. Be willing to confront your own bias. As journalists, we're taught to pull together many different threads to bring all these perspectives into play. But I think we still sometimes, too often, end up resorting to cliches and reinforcing stereotypes. I always notice mine when I sit down with the artist T. Shanathanan. Shana's most recent work was called The Cabinet of Resistance, and he made it for the Kochi Muziris Biennale. And it was this old filing cabinet with 30 drawers. And into each of these drawers, he put these drawings and photographs and narratives from the long war, from the north. And there were some fascinating stories in there. There were stories of mechanics who converted their cars to run on kerosene during the economic embargo. There were women who, after many years of displacement, had one valuable thing, and it was their bridal saris, and they gave these up to be turned into sandbags to protect their families. But perhaps my favorite story of all is of an elderly woman in Jaffna. And she was there when the public transport system collapsed. And she became tired of relying on her family, as we will. And so for the first time in her life, this woman learned how to cycle. And she later told Shanathanan that it was the most incredibly liberating experience of her life. Shana, when we met, told me that he saw these stories as stories of resistance. And I remember having this moment, just listening to him and thinking, this doesn't fit my preconceived notions. These aren't my imaginings of what it's like to live through a war. And it's made me realize that our bias, it manifests in many different ways. As both journalists and readers, I think too often we want the headline to say it all. We want our victims to be weak. We want our perpetrators to be heartless. We want to stuff people into 140 characters and discuss issues as if they were black or white and nothing in between. I suppose what I'm really admitting here is that the hardest thing about cultivating curiosity is not in having the conversations or rejecting boredom or looking for surprises. For me, it's in being willing to investigate my own prejudice, to see the stereotypes that I unthinkingly replicate. It's in remembering Shana's lesson that we are all creatures of nuance. I suspect, and the real test of your curiosity will be in how good you are at being curious about yourself. How clearly do you see your own bias? Now, what will you do about it? I imagined at this point that you would also have a question for me, possibly. You would ask me, this sounds like a lot of work. Why bother? Well, I hope we've seen that it has intellectual and social benefits. But I would also argue that today in Sri Lanka, curiosity is a necessity. You have a new Right to Information Act. It gives you, citizens, the right to be curious about your government. And this isn't some idle exercise. It's something sharper, more persistent, an antidote to apathy. With a new constitution on the table, you have to be willing to be curious about the ways in which the old one failed you, and curious about the ways in which the new one could be made better. On this small island, where communities have been separated for so long by war, by misinformation, by political maneuvering, curiosity, genuine curiosity about each other's experiences, curiosity without prejudice, curiosity without defensiveness, could be the first step toward building the kind of country we'd all like to live in, that we would like to leave our children. The science astronomer, one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, once said something that really just, it stuck in my brain. He was talking about Earth out there, in this vast galaxy, and he said, our world is made significant by the courage of our questions and the depth of our answers. And that is where I'd like to leave you today, with this idea that curiosity can be a radical act. All you have to do is start with a question.